So I've just finished reading Tim Keller's Every Good Endeavour, and my general recommendation is it's a good book to read for Christians and a must-read for two particular groups of Christians. What I would start with is the must-read would be for those who are still thinking about a career. So I'd say particularly high school students or university students who are thinking about the jobs they're going to get after their degrees. I think it's actually quite good for high school students because in the book it opens your mind to sort of different jobs or different roles that are out there that maybe your parents or maybe society isn't really pushing you towards. And once you're in university, if you're in a degree that still allows for a lot of flexibility, like arts, science, engineering, that kind of thing, then I think this book is also still helpful because it helps you ask the question of, okay, what am I good at? And how can I apply those skills in a job that is meaningful, that is good, and that I can find sort of purpose and a sense of living in. The other group I'd highly recommend this book to is those who are struggling in their jobs at the moment, right? If they're not really happy with where they are at their jobs, if they don't feel like they have a sense of purpose at their jobs, or they feel like something is a bit meaningless, this would be a really good book to read. And for me personally, I'm quite happy with where I am at the moment. I was very unhappy with where I was about a year or 2 years ago, and I thankfully left that job. And so I think this would have been a really helpful book for me to read at that time, had I been aware of it. So they'd be my two recommendations of who should read this. If you are a Christian and you are happy with your job, there is still a reason to read this book, and it's basically so that you can share it with others. There might be people in your life that you know that are not in that position, and being able to make that direct connection, hey, I know you're struggling, I know work is hard for you, why don't you try reading this book? I find it helpful, or other people have found it helpful, you might find it helpful as well. If you are a Christian who is happy with their job, I still think the most interesting chapters in this book are the last 4, and they're about the gospel and work. Because even if you are happy in your job, it still helps answer the question of what does it really look like for a Christian to live or to work in a non-Christian world, or in the world with unbelievers as well. How does the gospel shape the way that I work? I think those last 4 chapters are particularly good for that kind of perspective. So those 4 chapters I'd recommend to any Christian, but the whole book in general I'd recommend to those who are struggling with their jobs or those who are looking and thinking about jobs. If you're not a Christian and you're reading this, there is some material in there for you. So there are some comparisons of traditional worldviews. You know, Tim Keller makes the point in one of the chapters about how important worldviews are and how they are a lens of which you use to see everything. And so those are helpful, and I think it still is insightful to understand that, you know, some cultures are traditional, some are modern, some are postmodern, and all of these cultures is not just a progression of one is better than the other. They all have their underlying beliefs of what is good, what is bad, what the problem is with the world, and how it can be fixed. And none of them are neutral, right? And I think if you're a non-Christian, it's still helpful to see that and to read that. In your case, the last 4 chapters will probably be less helpful for you, except for understanding how Christians might think about work. But obviously it'd be harder for you to apply if you're not a Christian yourself. Now, I thought I might just go through some of the chapter titles and talk briefly about each one. The book is actually broken up into 3 sections, part 1, part 2, part 3, and each section has 4 chapters inside it. So the first 4 chapters are called God's Plan for Work, and it starts with the design of work and really goes down to talking about when God first created the garden. We have a story of him working for 6 days and resting on the 7th day. And he makes the comment that we talk about work-life balance, but the interesting biblical thing is that the balance, you know, by those days, is 6 days of work, 1 day off, or 1 day of leisure, 1 day of rest. And so when we're talking about balance, we're not necessarily talking about 50-50. It should be good to acknowledge that work is actually meaningful and it's important, even in those numbers of days. That the goal shouldn't necessarily be do as little work as possible. The second one talks about the dignity of work, and it's the fact that under Christian philosophy, all work provides dignity, right? It is something that you're doing, and the reason is we are all made in God's image, and God worked, and we are sort of working almost on God's behalf, or we are continuing his work. And that's true whether you are a baker, whether you are a plumber, whether you are a doctor, whether you're a lawyer, like all of those cases is still the continuation of work that God is doing. So work gives dignity compared to sort of the ancient Greek philosophy of some jobs are demeaning, like physical labor, and some jobs are much more worthy of honor, like say being a politician or something in ancient Greece. So the Christian perspective does change how you see that. The third one talks about work as cultivation. That all jobs, if you can see it, the way that God formed the earth, where it was something that was void and he shaped it, he formed it to his will. If we see our jobs like that, it can be helpful. I'm, in teaching personally, and he says even if you're a teacher, you sort of see there's some raw material, there's some knowledge in a student's mind, but maybe it hasn't completely come together and it hasn't been connected yet. And part of your job as a teacher is doing that cultivation that God is doing, and helping them connect those dots together. And obviously that's really true in something like manufacturing, where you're getting raw materials and turning it into something, but it's seeing work as that cultivation of something. And then the fourth one talks about work as service, right? That God gives us our daily bread, but how do we get daily bread, right? Daily bread needs a farmer to grow the grain, it needs a miller to turn it into flour, it needs a baker to turn the flour and water and stuff into bread, and truck drivers to transport everything from where it's made to us. All of those people, in their jobs, they're not just doing it for themselves, they're actually serving others. Work is how God acts out his providence and provides for us. And I thought that was a really interesting way to think about things. And part of the message of that then is one of the best things you can do for your work, biblically, is be good at it, right? Be competent. Actually do it well and wholeheartedly, because your work ultimately is serving others. The next section of 4 chapters is called The Problem with Work, or Our Problems with Work. And it talks about 4 things. It starts with work becoming fruitless. That we've all done something where we've tried hard, we've worked at something, and it hasn't quite reaped the results that we wanted. And he talks about how that is a result of sin. Previously, the land in the Garden of Eden in Genesis 1 and 2 brought forth fruit on its own. But after sin, it's explicitly said that man is going to have to work hard to cultivate that land. And an interesting point that was mentioned much earlier is man was actually working before the fall, right? There is work that is done in chapter 2. So work still happens before the fall. Work is good regardless. But work after sin can often be fruitless. You till the ground, but it's so hard, nothing comes out, right? And that's something that we experience in our day-to-day life. And his encouragement was to accept that happens here on earth, and that ultimately in heaven is where you see work done with complete fruit. And you don't have that same fruitlessness if there is no sin in heaven. The 6th one is about work becomes pointless, and he mostly goes through Ecclesiastes and talks about the fact that in the long scheme of things, any sort of status or legacy or anything you get from your work is going to be gone, right? It's meaningless, it's pointless. That's sort of the theme in the book of Ecclesiastes, looking at things on the earth. Now, Ecclesiastes' solution comes in 2 ways. One is looking at God, right? When we put God in the picture, work is no longer pointless. And the other is, if we are just looking at it under the sun, enjoy it, right? Work should be something that is enjoyed. And he comments on the fact that many people don't enjoy their work, partly because the options that they thought were available to them were only limited to a handful of things. In reality, there may be 6, 7, 8, 10 more types of jobs that they hadn't even considered that might be more aligned with their skills and competencies there. The 7th one is about work becomes selfish. I think it's partly about work sort of creating your identity, or you doing work entirely for you or for your gain. And that can be a problem with work. And then the 8th one is about work revealing our idols, of putting money above other things is a big context in work. And your idols are revealed by sort of your behaviors, right? What you are beholden to and what you follow, and that is true in your work as well. The last section of the book is called The Gospel and Work, and this is the one that I recommend to any Christian, whether you like your job or not. And it starts with a new story for work. And this is where he talks about the idea that all cultures have a sort of story, right? And he compares it to the hero story, where, in movies, a hero is called, and then they refuse the call, and then they come back, and they eventually accept it, and so on. And you see the growth for the character. And any sort of movie that has something that's happening, a problem that occurs, and then a solution to that problem. And he talks about the fact that all people have that idea. Capitalism, for example, or Marxism, has the idea that there's a problem, it's both inequality, solution, the state should handle things, and the sort of fundamental ideology behind it being that things should be fair or things that should be equal, or whatever. So he puts the gospel as one of those stories. And as one of those stories, the gospel's story is the problem is sin, right? The problem is not one part of the world or another part of the world. The problem is sin, which affects all parts of the world. The solution is nothing we can do, and the solution is entirely through God and his reconciliation with us. And seeing work like this means that there's no one part of work that is a problem that the Marxist might have or the capitalist might have as a problem, or no one part of the world that is a solution. It is all messed up by sin, and all of it needs to be restored through God. Chapter 10 is about a new conception of work, and that chapter was actually really helpful for me. It was about whether Christians are the only ones who participate in work, or Christians and non-Christians play a part together participating in work. And this is often a big question, because often what comes up is we find that non-Christians can be competent at their jobs, right? The same way that we said Christians should be competent at their jobs, or should take that stance, and often more competent or sometimes more competent than Christians. Also, and vice versa, Christians can show bad behaviors or can be worse sometimes, than non-Christians, even though that shouldn't be the case. And he sort of seeks to give an explanation for this and what this means for a Christian. And his explanation is two things. It's sin and it's common grace. Sin basically being the fact that we are all struck by sin, and that can mean that Christians are not acting, the way that they should. They're not quite at the heights of demonstrating their dedication to work as they should. And common grace being the fact that God gives gifts to all people, right? Christians or non-Christians. And he uses those gifts, even in non-Christians, to serve others and to bring a benefit to the world as a whole. And his fundamental point at the end is that there's really only, there's a couple of ways of Christians viewing the work of non-Christians. You can have what I think he calls a thin view of sin, which says because non-Christians, they're not Christian, I shouldn't work with them, I shouldn't collaborate with them, they are not able to do good work. Or you can have another side that just uncritically, completely accepts whatever the world is doing and does things in the exact same way. But he instead encourages what he calls integration, which is the sort of critical thinking and acceptance of what people do, both Christians and non-Christians, critically looking at it, thinking about it, and accepting it if it is part of God's good plan for work, and rejecting it if it is not. So that's a little bit there about chapter 10 on the conception of work. After that, you have a new compass for work, which talks about the direction. Why is it we do what we do? And in this case, he talks a lot about ethics, right? Christian ethics and things like that. He talks about the fact that the limitation of ethics usually in business books and the like is that the ethical thing to do is also generally good for business, right? And his comment is like, yes, this must be true on average. It's mentioned in all of these business books that acting ethically, acting honestly, acting morally is a good business decision in the end. But really the question for ethics is there will be times where acting ethically will not be good for business. And is that something that your worldview can support? Whereas Christianity, when we're looking at God's love and what he's done for us, the hope, the faith that we have, is able to not just say acting ethically is something that's good for business. No, instead says, I'm willing to act ethically. I want to act the way that God wants me to act, even though I know I might suffer for it, right? And it has a very different conception. There's a story that is part of it. I can't remember if this is part of chapter 10 or chapter 11. But he talks about a woman who once comes to church. And he goes and he asks her why she came. And eventually she says she came to church because she had made a big mistake at work. And her boss had actually taken the blame entirely for her mistake. And she was shocked and surprised and went to him and said, look, I've seen bosses that have taken the credit for my work. I've never seen a boss that's taken the blame for my mistake. And she pushed from him for why. And he gave his reason as, look, Christ took the blame for my mistakes, for my sins, for what I deserved. And so I only thought it would be good to, repeat that or to try to show that and imitate my Savior and take the blame when I can as well. And that was really powerful for that woman. That's what brought her to church, is the actions that she saw in that man during the workplace. The last chapter talks about a new powerful work, and that chapter talks about work and its sense of purpose. So he comments for a good while about the word sloth or laziness that's often translated as one of the 7 deadly sins. And he says that actually it should be translated slightly differently. It's not that the sin is laziness, right? Not caring. The sin is only caring when it's out of self-gain. The original Greek or Latin behind that word is something along those lines. So only caring when it's in your self-gain. And that is not the powerful work that Christianity wants. Not just caring when it's for your self-gain, but caring because it is being done unto God, being done for God, caring because it is serving your neighbor, right? That same conception of work that we were talking about before. And he makes the comment of the opposite of that, not caring unless it relates to you, which is passion. And he talks about the passion of the Christ. And passion of the Christ in that sense literally means the suffering of the Christ. And that is something that Christians, should be or can do, which is conviction to the point that they'd be willing to suffer for what they believed, right? Complete opposite to someone who is not willing to do anything unless it pertains to them. There is also an epilogue at the end about leading people to integrate faith and work. It's interesting. It's really only applicable, I think, if you're trying to run a church that is trying to integrate people into faith and work. But it tells you a little bit about their church and what they do for it. So, in summary, every good endeavor. Definitely would recommend if you're thinking about work or you're struggling with your current job, and also would recommend the last couple of chapters for any Christians, and just giving it a read so you can recommend it to others. Hopefully that's been helpful, and if you enjoyed this review, hopefully you'll check out the book, and I'd love to hear from you about it. Bye.